Today on This Week in Space, we visit with author Andy Chaikin, author of the best book on the Apollo program, A Man on the Moon.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is This Week in Space, episode number 35, recorded October 28th, 2022. A Man on the Moon with author Andrew Chaikin. This episode of This Week in Space is brought to you by ExpressVPN. Incognito mode does not mean invisible. If you really want to go incognito and protect your privacy, make yourself as invisible as possible with the #1 rated VPN, ExpressVPN. For 3 extra months free with a 1-year package, go to expressvpn.com/twists. Hello and welcome to another episode of This Week in Space, the Man on the Moon edition. I'm Rod Pyle, editor-in-chief of Ad Astra Magazine, and I'm joined by the indispensable Tariq Malik, editor-in-chief at space.com.
Hello. Oh, hey, Rod. How are you doing? How are you doing today?
I'm good. Good to see you, as always. And today we're talking to a very special guest, my old friend Andy Chaikin, author of A Man on the Moon, by most considered the seminal narrative of the Apollo program, and many other fine books, including A Passion for Mars, and he's a rock star at NASA as well, as you'll soon learn. Good morning, Andy.
Hello.
Good morning. It's good to be with you guys.
It's great to see you again. It's been far too long. Now, before we embark on our journey, we have a space joke, as we always do. This one from Ken Kramer of Silver Lake, California. Hey, Tariq, what happens when the Perseverance rover lands on your dining room table?
What happens, Rod? I don't know. That's never happened to me before.
It mars the finish.
Love it.
Oh,
That's a good one. Thank you, Ken.
Ant's feeling kind today. Yes, thanks, Ken Kramer, for that indispensable joke. And a reminder, we're soliciting your best or lame space jokes. Give me your best shot at TWIS at twit.com. That's twists at twit.tv, not twit.com. Each week, we'll pick 1 or 2 of the best jokes and read them on the air at the sufferance of our very patient guests. And you will get credit because we love our fans. Now let's get to some headlines real quick. Tariq, our traditional Artemis update, please.
Yes, we need that typewriter music, but we have a new hot off the press update from NASA on Artemis 1 today. And that update is that NASA will give a new update on Artemis 1 next week. And so on Thursday, everyone mark your calendars on November, I think that's the 3rd at noon, NASA's going to dish on their plans to launch Artemis 1 on the 14th. Seems like they're fairly locked in to November 14th for that launch. If you want to stay up late, it's at 12:07 in the morning. It's about an hour and a half launch, 69 minutes. And if they get off the ground, that means that they'll come back to Earth on December 9th after a 25-and-a-half-day mission. So we'll learn more, including if they're still going to roll out on November 4th, which is what their no earlier plan was, on Thursday the 3rd. So mark your calendars, and hopefully we'll know more next week.
So does that launch window necessitate a shorter mission? Because it's been advertised as long as 40 days, I think.
Yeah, it does depend on the windows, right? So there are some profiles that do get shorter, but this is because of where the moon is and where they're going and how they have to get this special entry window on the way there to get to the moon for it. So the 14th, the 16th, and the 19th are what NASA has been targeting, but we'll find out if they've changed that plan because they did not mention those 2 backup dates in their update today.
And because Halloween is in just a few days, and a shout out to my friend Susan Martin, who has a birthday on Halloween. How's that for a birthday? You've got, I know you're just itching to give us a couple of spooky Halloween stories because there's something happening at the edge of the solar system. We have a rumpled heliopause.
There's something strange in the heliopause, apparently, that's out there. And some scientists have said there's something spooky going on up there. They've detected using signals from Voyager 1, Voyager 2, and this satellite that watches the edge of our solar system called the IBEX satellite. They found out that this heliopause, which is like the bubble around our solar system that protects us all from just the interstellar space, is rippling and creating these weird angles of how it works out there. And they don't really know why. It's just a really weird behavior. And so they're trying to figure out what that is and what makes those changes. It might affect, how our solar system interacts with our neighborhood in the galaxy. It may also affect spacecraft that are out there, like Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, just trying to chug along and explore interstellar space. But it's a really weird thing that they detected, and it's also fun to talk about Voyager 1 because it's been just out there for so long.
So this is on top when they, within the first year or two of crossing that boundary, they did notice that it was a little folded and odd, kind of like as somebody related it to how brain tissue kind of folds back on itself. So this must be on top of that earlier detection, right?
Yeah, so it is. And what the really strange thing was that Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 did launch, in the same year back in 77. And they entered the interstellar space. They crossed this boundary at really different times, with Voyager 1 doing it in 2012 and Voyager 2 in 2018. And so they think that this rippling might explain why they had such a big gap between those two events themselves.
All right. And in the We Haven't Seen This Rocket Launch in a Long Time column, you've got some news for us on the Falcon Heavy.
That's right. SpaceX is poised to launch their first Falcon Heavy launch in 3 years since 2019. That's the biggest, the most powerful rocket right now that is in use. Of course, NASA wants to launch SLS, then that will be the most powerful one. And then maybe SpaceX's Starship will take that title later on. But for now, it's Falcon Heavy. They're launching a payload for the U.S. Space Force called USSF, I believe it's 44, if memory serves. And it's weird. It's been 3 years. SpaceX really touted this rocket as their big go-to for big missions. And then we've only seen a few of them. My colleague Mike Wall over at space.com really looked into this in a story that we're running actually today about why it's taken them so long. And part of it is the payloads for SpaceX's Falcon Heavy missions have been delayed. This one that's launching on November 1st has been delayed since 2020. And so there's also kind of a general lack of need for this specific vehicle itself. And so that's been a part of it right now. SpaceX also is very, very focused on Starship, which may have been playing part of that too. So.
Yeah, and you got to wonder if it's expensive to cobble together a Falcon Heavy when you're used to running Falcon 9s all the time. And you can learn more about these three stories and so much more over at space.com, where we source them all. Thank you very much, sir. And we will be back in just a moment to talk to super author Andy Chaikin after this short message, so stay with us. This episode of This Week in Space is brought to you by ExpressVPN. Have you ever browsed in incognito mode? It's probably not as incognito as you think. And why would it be? Chances are the browser you're using has made its fortune by tracking your movements online. And what do these big tech companies say when they're called out for collecting user data? Incognito does not mean invisible, they say. So how do you actually make yourself as invisible as possible online? You use ExpressVPN like I do. It turns out that even in incognito mode, your online activity still gets tracked and data brokers still get to buy and sell your data. One of these data points is your IP address. Data harvesters use your IP to uniquely identify you and your location. But with ExpressVPN, your connection gets rerouted through an encrypted server and your IP address is masked. Every time you connect to ExpressVPN, you get a random IP address shared by many other ExpressVPN customers. That makes it harder for third parties to identify you or harvest your data. Best of all, ExpressVPN is super easy to use, no matter what device you're on, whether it be phone, laptop, or smart TV. All you have to do is tap one button for instant protection. I've been using ExpressVPN for months now, and I have to tell you, it's the easiest piece of software I've ever downloaded. You simply click on the download button for your device, implement the software, and it's up and running. No extra effort required. And when the updates come out, they're super easy to install too. I'm no software guru, and if I can use it easily, so can you. So give ExpressVPN a shot. So if you really want to go incognito and protect your privacy, secure yourself with the #1 rated VPN. Visit expressvpn.com/TWIS to get an extra 3 months for free. That's EXPRESSVPN.com/TWIS PRESSVPN.com/TWIS. Go to expressvpn.com/TWIS to learn more. Okay, so hey, Superauthor, you still with us?
I guess I can answer to that description without feeling too embarrassed. I'm here.
It's a better hey you than I usually get myself. You've written. I'm not actually. How many books have you written? I've lost count. Because there are a bunch of special editions and things that you co-author.
Right. If you include all the different editions of A Man on the Moon, including the brand new, well, not brand new anymore, but in 2021, a publisher in the UK called Folio Editions, a Folio Society, released a new illustrated edition of A Man on the Moon. So if you count all of the editions of that book, plus the others, it's somewhere around 10.
Wow.
But it's taken a long time.
Well, but we should make the point, you wrote that book in 1984, if I remember correctly.
No, I didn't write it in 84. I started it in 84. I had the idea for it.
What year did it publish?
It took me 8 years, and it wasn't I wasn't full time on it until 86. And it came out in the spring of 94. No, in 1984, I was still on the staff of Sky and Telescope magazine, and I was covering the early shuttle flights and helping to cover the Voyager missions and things like that. And I had this notion, hey, I'm a science writer now. I'm a space journalist. I'd like to do a book. And my first thought was actually I wanted to go to Antarctica with the guys who looked for meteorites. They were just starting to find meteorites from Mars and meteorites from the moon, and I had written about that for Sky and Tel, and I thought, boy, that'd be really cool. I think I want to go to the Antarctic with them. Well, I didn't really get a good, we'd be happy to have you. In fact, the principal investigator said, nope, I'm going to do my own book, so thanks, but no thanks. And a little bit of time went by, and I started to think, what I'm really fanatically interested in is Apollo. And it kind of hit me that nobody had written a book about the Apollo missions that made you feel like you were along for the ride, that really put you in the heads of the astronauts. And that was the goal I set for myself. And I did my first set of interviews with the Apollo 12 crew in the summer of 1985, wrote a sample chapter, which an agent had told me I needed to do, which was a little like Bring Me the Witch's Broomstick, right? Because I hadn't talked to any of the astronauts yet. Wrote my sample chapter, which was like 100 pages long, turned that into a book proposal, and then got a book contract at the beginning of 1986, and I was off to the races.
Huh. Wow.
What a book it is. It was, I just want to finish the thought. The reason I brought that up was, okay, so it was 94 instead of 84. Nonetheless, it's been in print in one form or another ever since. And that doesn't happen very often in our business.
Well, it was very well received, which I was very, very gratified about and still am. I still get fan mail, which is just a really great, experience. I don't get tired of that. It's just really gratifying to know how much people like the book and how it's influenced people. Even I've run into a number of astronauts who have told me that they read it when they were, either before they applied to be an astronaut or while they were going through the application process. Or Janice Voss, the shuttle astronaut, took it along on one of her shuttle flights, and I have a photo of her reading it on the middeck while she's on the little, fold-up exercise bike that they had. It's been more places than I have, and it's been really cool. It's been really great. I put my heart and soul into it, though, I must say. I mean, really, if you want to, and that's not hyperbole on my part. I really felt that I had to up my game as a writer to do justice to that material. I mean, I got to sit down with those guys, 23 out of the 24 lunar astronauts. Jack Swigert was no longer living. He had passed away in 82. But the other 23, I sat down with many of them for hours and just, was able to get on tape what they thought, what they felt, to the degree that they were comfortable talking about such things, which varied, But then having gotten these amazing stories, right, I really felt, okay, now it's on me to become the storyteller that this material demands. And that's one of the reasons it took 8 years, aside from the fact that some of the guys were reluctant to get involved at first and took some time to get to them. And, I had a wonderful editor in the last couple of years of the project. My publisher brought on a freelance editor named Connie Roosevelt, who was just fabulous. And it really made the difference. It was like graduate school, learning how to, I learned that every paragraph and sometimes every sentence can advance the story. And it was a tremendous education. Anyway.
But yeah, I mean, it's a Bible for space fans, I think. A Man on the Moon is for anyone who wants to learn about just the program and where it came from in general. My follow up always is what your origin story in space was, because you mentioned Sky and Telescope, you were writing there, but were you always like a big space fan there, Andy? Like little Andy Chaikin building his model rockets, on the floor? Where did that start for you?
Yeah, it's 5-year-old me on the floor with astronomy books, picture books about space, and illustrations of what it would be like someday when humans go to other worlds, the moon, Mars, moons of Saturn. All of the artwork was probably stolen from Chesley Bonestell and then dumbed down for these kids' books, but not all of it. Some of it was great on its own. That's kind of a side passion of mine, is the art of space and children's books about space and serious space art as well. But it was the pictures that hooked me, right? I mean, it was like, I've referred to them as magic portals, that I felt like I could transport myself to these other worlds. And even at 5, 6, 7 years old, I was completely captivated by that. And of course, at the same time, I was 5 in 1961. So that was the year that Gagarin and Shepard became the first humans in space. And from there, it just grew. It just kept getting more and more exciting. When I was 9, the summer I turned 9 was when Ed White walked in space on Gemini 4, and those incredible pictures taken by Jim McDivitt, who we just lost, some of the most glorious pictures ever in the history of the space program, splashed across the pages of Life magazine. And, I wanted to be Ed White. I wanted to do that. And whenever I was in a swimming pool from then on, I would just kind of hang there and look at the bottom of the pool and imagine that I was walking in space. And that was like the most exciting thing that there was going on. And it just stayed with me. Every Apollo mission, I was at the TV with my map of the moon, all the articles from Time and Newsweek that had come out about the mission, the model of the Revell model kit of the spacecraft. I had my own little mission control in the den, and I just was, as hard as I could, I was trying to be a vicarious participant in this incredible adventure. And then, as I started to hear more and more about the geology of the moon, and also, by the way, the Mariner missions to Mars, which were discovering giant volcanoes and, enormous canyons and ancient river valleys, geology started to become a really strong interest, and I went to college to study geology, and I was lucky enough to I did this on purpose. I went to Brown University because Thomas Much, Mutch is how that was spelled, was a very noteworthy lunar and soon-to-be Martian geologist. He was the principal investigator on the Viking Mars lander cameras, so I was in on that as an intern when I was in college. My other professor, Jim Head, helped train the astronauts who walked on the moon. When I got out of college, I worked for Farouk El-Baz at the Center for Earth and Planetary Studies at the Air and Space Museum at the Smithsonian, and he had trained the astronauts who orbited the moon. It just kind of kept adding to it and adding to it. And so by the time I decided to write the book, I felt like I was doing something that I had been immersed in most of my life.
It's funny how it's that exposure as a kid to the books that like galvanizes everything. For me, it was a Time Life book of the solar system that had this section about what life might be like on the different planets or their moons or stuff, and it just ripples all the way down, to be full circle like that. So,
and that's
Rod, do you have a kid's book? Yeah. Go ahead, Andy. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's one of the reasons why I get so much joy out of having been, successful as an author, successful in the sense of creating books that people like, that inspire them, that they find impactful. Because you're exactly right. Books are what lit the fire in me.
In answer to the question, I think we're going to ask Tariq. When I was in elementary school, I wandered over to our small library across the street, hungrily looking for books on the future of the Apollo space program, and all they had was the big golden book of rockets, in which everything looked like a silver banana and a V2. And it was a little discouraging. And that probably primed my interest for books like Andy's. And Andy, one thing that really struck me about A Man on the Moon the first time I read it, of many, I'll confess, was, we had seen a lot of books on Apollo by this time, but we hadn't seen anything, at least I hadn't seen anything, that was a standing next to the guys as they're landing on the moon, over the shoulder vicarious experience, because you interviewed them in such depth. I'm guessing you were able to really put us in the moment. And I think that was probably a very deliberate choice.
Well, it was a lot of it. The interviews were the backbone of the book, but the meat on the bones was also derived from just delving into everything I could get my hands on. So, I read the transcripts cover to cover. Actually, I did that before I did my interviews so that I would know exactly what I wanted to ask. I looked at every second of the onboard movie film that they shot, the television transmissions that they sent down. I read the technical debriefings. I just, became a scholar of each mission. And you have to do something like, you have to delve into a subject. If you're going to write a book and make it effective, you have to be that knowledgeable. You have to delve into it at that level. And I mean, I could show you a page in A Man on the Moon and point to where, okay, that came from my interview with that particular astronaut. That came from a debriefing. That came from a Life magazine article, on and on and on and on. So that's another kind of hint at why it took 8 years to write that book, to write about all those different missions and all those different astronauts.
Well, it's a hell of an impressive work, and I stand slack-jawed in admiration for your work. And that was brought home to me when I was reaching out to Al Bean. I think it was for a History Channel show I was doing. And you may have put together that connection, because I remember, I don't remember talking to you about it, but I remember when I first got a hold of him and I said, thanks for speaking to me. And he said, and a friend of Andy's is a friend of mine. And I thought, oh man, this guy is a major player.
Alan was a gem. I miss him every day. He was a great mentor to me. The first time I met Alan, I was 12 years old. My parents took me to the Kennedy Space Center. I was on my way to being 13, and as an advance birthday present, they took me down to the Cape that spring for a few days. And just by luck, we happened to be staying at the motel where all of the astronauts stayed when they were at the Cape. It was a motel called the Cape Kennedy Hilton. And I walked into the lobby with my parents, and there were all these signed pictures of the astronauts. And I just was, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And the lady behind the desk was so nice to me. And she said, well, if you go out in the parking lot tomorrow morning, you might just meet an astronaut. So I was out there.
Aww.
I think I was probably out there at 7:00. I was out there at 7:00.
Waited for 6 hours, right?
Yeah, well, no, Alan and Jim Irwin came right out pretty soon. And Alan and Jim were the first ones I met. Alan had just been named to Apollo 12, and Jim was his backup. And Alan was so kind to me and invited me over to his room that evening and gave me a copy of he gave me a command module instrument panel chart that he had been using to train, and he had signed it for me.
Wow.
And what a time. That was just incredible. And Alan and I became pretty close friends in the process of my interviewing him for the book, getting to know him in that process, the years that it took to do that. He was always in my cheering section. And then in the many years after the book, he and I ended up doing a book together of his artwork.
Right.
And I wrote a chunk of the text, and that was a cool experience too. And again, the artwork, we connected about that as well, because Alan was a very talented painter, right, and made a real name for himself as a kind of a chronicler of the Apollo missions on canvas. So, yeah.
So I have a follow-up question, and then Tariq, I'll get out of the way for you to ask yours. But you mentioned having interviewed all the Apollo lunar astronauts, and I was trying to think of that group. Now, I didn't meet all of them. I met probably a third or half, but or at least interviewed a third or half. But I was trying to think who might be the most challenging interview out of that bunch. And the name John Young floats into my mind.
Say it again.
I never saw you interview John Young, but I saw him interviewed on a number of occasions, and there are a lot of long questions answered by, yep.
No, John was the one I was thinking of as the most challenging. But it was funny because I remember saying to one of the public affairs guys at Johnson Space Center after the interview, I said, I thought it was going to be like pulling teeth, but instead he kind of pulled the teeth out and handed them to me. And it was an odd experience because John, was not, your usual, he was not always a user-friendly guy to try and communicate with in that kind of a setting. And he didn't make eye contact. I mean, he made eye contact with me once when I mentioned that there had been a pressure spike in his suit during one of the EVAs on Apollo 16. And he looked at me and he said, "Did they say it was a pressure spike?" And that was the only time in the whole interview that we made eye contact. But even though it was different and definitely unusual, I got some really good stuff from John Young too. And, John kind of loosened up over the years too, after I was done with the book, and I'd call him up every once in a while. And when I was in town, I was in the Space Center a couple of times. I went up to see him in his office, and I can't say I knew him well, but, what amazed me was how different the guys were from one another. We had all been brought up on this Life magazine kind of sameness. They were all kind of out of the same cookie cutter on the pages of Life, right? I mean, as a kid, I had soaked up those articles and the kind of, gallows humor of, dry humor of the astronauts, like, well, if the engine doesn't light, that could ruin your whole day, and I'm sure you guys remember seeing things like that. But then when I sat down to talk to them, I found out, hey, these guys are remarkably different. They're actually along a whole spectrum of personalities. I mean, two guys as different as Frank Borman and Ed Mitchell, right? Frank Borman, commander of Apollo 8, very no-nonsense, gruff, military-style commander, really was not too much of a fan of science on the Apollo missions because he really felt like we got enough to worry about just getting there and getting back. And at that time, he was pretty much right, although, there was a little room for science even on Apollo 8. But then you take a guy like Ed Mitchell, who underneath his, macho test pilot exterior was fascinated by psychic phenomena and the nature of consciousness and the nature of the universe, and took ESP cards, or actually not the cards themselves, but numbers that corresponded to the cards, along on Apollo 14 and tried an experiment in ESP on the way to the moon. Some guys who said, Mitchell was one of them, that going to the moon profoundly changed his outlook on things. Other guys who said, nope, it didn't change me, and they were proud of that. And then a whole bunch of guys in between. Seeing the Earth as small enough that you can cover it with your outstretched thumb, particularly in contrast to this bleached, barren lunar horizon. They would say, well, it didn't change me as a person, but it certainly changed my perspective. They would say things like, well, I didn't come home and become, an environmentalist, but they would talk about the fact that is something that stays with you, and you kind of carry that different perspective around. So I was very taken with the fact that these were very distinct individuals, and that's one of the things I tried to convey in the book.
Anyone say no, Andy? Like you're like, I'd like to interview you, but no, I don't want to be part of this book that you're putting together.
Yeah, a few of them said that for a while, and then I wore them down.
Who was the hardest to chase down, and how did you convince them to be part of the book? Because I had heard that like Neil was really hard to get down. Neil Armstrong, obviously. But you mentioned earlier the only one that you weren't able to get was Jack Swigert, who had passed away by then.
He had passed away, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Neil was a challenge for sure, and I did finally get to him. I had some help on that from Bill Anders, who knew Neil pretty well, and recommended to Neil that he consider talking to me. And at that point, it became a conversation via his secretary, and he asked to see the sample chapter I had written on Apollo 12. I sent it to him, and then I screwed up my courage a couple of months later because I hadn't heard anything back. Screwed up my courage to call, and Neil picked up the phone, and I could barely talk. I was so nervous, but he was impressed with the chapter, and I did one of these, in quietly in my office as I heard that.
A silent fist pump there. So
yeah, a silent fist pump, and we worked it out. We worked out a time to meet. He was in Washington, D.C., and I spent a couple of hours with him in his hotel room, asking him the questions that I had, really distilled from all of my research, all of my thinking about Apollo 11. But I'll tell you, the hardest to get to was Ken Mattingly. Huh. He had, of course, he was command module pilot on Apollo 16. He had been very busy after NASA Of course, he flew a couple of shuttle missions as well. And then he went into the DoD. He was, I think he was running the Naval Space Weapons Command when I first reached out to him. And he turned me down. And I said, but even Neil Armstrong is talking to me. And he said, sorry. And it wasn't until 1992 that I got in touch with him again. I said, everybody else you're the last guy. And he said, well, let's see what we can do about that. And that turned out to be worth the wait. I got to his condo in suburban Virginia, the DC area, and got there like 9 o'clock at night, and I didn't leave until 3 a.m.
Wow.
And, fortunately he was a night owl, and man, it was like he was reliving the flight in front of me. And he was just the most interesting, thoughtful, reflective guy on so many levels. It was just a fabulous experience, one of the best. So, like I say, really worth the wait.
So I presume you have, you interviewed all these guys, and you've got a lot of material, hours and hours and hours of talks with them. Clearly, some of that didn't make it into the books. And you've got, other than the oral history collection at NASA, possibly one of the better collections of that period of time for the space race than anybody. Do you have any plans of what you're going to do with what remains that we haven't seen?
Some of it is in a book that I did with my wife, Vicky, called Voices from the Moon.
Right.
If people are interested in getting a better feel for what actually came out of the astronauts' mouths, they might want to take a look at that. And all these are on the books page of my site, andrewchaikin.com/books. As far as the interviews themselves, yeah, I think about that a lot. What's the best way to make that available to researchers, to the general public? And right now, I just have, my plate is so full with this new phase of my career that I've been in for the last 10 years on the human behavior elements of success and failure in spaceflight projects, which I can say more about. But I've had very little bandwidth to really move ahead with plans on how to curate those interviews and make them available. But I assure you that is high on my list of things that I want to take care of in the years to come. Okay,
I'll be by in about 3 days, and we'll sit together. Some of them may disappear. So Tariq, ask whatever you got left, and then I want to move on to the HBO show after we take a break.
Yeah,
go ahead and ask.
Yeah, you mentioned, and Andy, you mentioned earlier about, sadly we've lost Jim McDivitt, recently, and one of the things that really strikes me about A Man on the Moon that is really, I think, being crystallized for people that are interested in space and just people that live through it now is that we are of a time where we are losing a lot of the people that actually did these missions, not just these astronauts that you chronicle their lives, but the engineers behind them and all of that. At a time when NASA's trying to get back to the moon, there's all these other ways to get there, and I'm wondering if how if it's kind of just come up about just how much of a record the book has become, and what it's like to kind of put all of that time and to get to know these astronauts that you grew up with. It sounds like now, literally with your childhood meeting of the astronauts there, and knowing that we've kind of lost that history and the impact of their loss and even as there's this kind of new push that's going on right now, why that's relevant.
Well, I feel endlessly thankful that I was able to sit down with them and record their impressions and their memories. But I'm also very conscious of the fact that they're only part of the story. And again, this work that I've been doing for the last 10 years at the request of NASA to put down on paper what it takes to do something as demanding, as unforgiving as spaceflight, and particularly putting humans on the moon like we did in Apollo and like we're now trying to do again with Artemis. That story is about so much more than the guys, the folks, men and women now who get to go and make the flight, right? I'm delving into aspects of Apollo, and this is one of the things I love about Apollo is that no matter how much you learn about it, you can go delve into some aspect of it and learn things you didn't know. That's very cool stuff. I'm not just talking about geek fest, oh, the hose went this way instead of that way. I mean, really substantive things about how it was done and why it succeeded. Or conversely, why did we have a fire that killed Grissom, White, and Chappie? I have been delving into the human piece of the system, the human behaviors that got us off track with the fire, and then the behaviors that got us back on track and allowed us to carry out Apollo's mission. I say us, I mean those guys who were doing it when I was in junior high and high school and before even. And that is a huge piece of the story. I mean, I just had an hour and a half conversation the other day, earlier this week, with an 87-year-old engineer who worked on the Apollo 1 spacecraft. He was the project engineer for that spacecraft as they were preparing it for the flight. And he told me things that I had never heard before. And it's all going into this. Well, I've been teaching a course at NASA called Principles of Success in Spaceflight. I've also taught it at the Missile Defense Agency under another name. And Vicki and I are now nearing we hope, the finish line on the companion book for the course, which goes through this framework of human behaviors, then a really deep dive into the causes of the fire, and then the recovery from the fire. And I feel that, I mean, it's not as maybe as flashy or as, mainstream as talking to the astronauts, but I feel that I am potentially making as important a contribution with this work as I did with A Man on the Moon. Mm-hmm. And I really feel that Apollo has so much to teach us, not just about space and how to do spaceflight, but how to do hard things in general. It's almost as if, I've said this many times, it's almost as if the country funded a decade-long experiment in how to do really hard things with really large groups of people. Because the techniques, the practices that made Apollo successful can, I think, be applied in almost any area of human endeavor.
Well, we're going to be back to talk more about your leadership lessons and about your career as an actor with Tom Hanks, no less, after this short break. So your wonderful book was adapted for television by Tom Hanks and crew for a show called From the Earth to the Moon in early on, right? Shortly after it came out?
Well, what happened was, this is kind of a fun story. So my book came out in the spring of 1994. And that was right around the time that Ron Howard was gearing up to do the movie Apollo 13. And Jim Lovell's book, which he co-wrote with Jeff Kluger, came out in the fall of 94. And, I was kind of bummed out that they weren't, having me as a consultant on the film. And I thought, oh, I'm just kind of left behind here, but I got over that, because what happened was I got to visit the set of the film a couple of times through a friend who knew the production designer. And I met Tom Hanks, and I met Ron Howard. I met the other actors, and got to hang out a little bit. And I saw that they were all reading my book, and I remember being in Tom's trailer and seeing my book with all these little, Post-its in it, and handwritten, notations in the margin. Well, that was the fall of 94, and the spring of 95, I was down at the Air and Space Museum working on my second book, which is a history of flight called Air and Space that I did for the museum. And I checked my voicemail at home, my answering machine. In those days, we had physical answering machines. That's how old we are. And I get this message that says, Andy Chaikin, this is Tom Hanks. I don't know how I got your number, but I did. It's 4:00 in Los Angeles. This is my private number. Please don't give it out. I want to talk to you about something. Well, I called him back, and the something that he wanted to talk to me about turned out to be this ultimately 12-part miniseries that he had already mapped out. A few weeks later, I met with him in a hotel in New York City for several hours. He had all the episodes, scoped out on these little cards. And, he made it happen. He had the kind of clout that you need to get somebody like HBO to fork over however many millions of dollars they did, in the tens of millions. I remember that. I don't remember the exact number right now, to produce this miniseries. And he brought me in on the ground floor, which was just a fabulous experience. The thing that made it so great was his devotion to the real story. Mm-hmm. He wasn't trying to, dress it up with any kind of Hollywood, made up, storylines about. I don't know if you remember, there was a movie about Apollo 13 that was on ABC TV a couple of years after the mission, and it was pretty bad.
It was a TV movie, actually, and those were always awful because we had to go into the divorces that were coming and the drama on the ground and all this made up junk. Well, and a flight controller
who had a heart attack, which did not happen. Right. They had to make this stuff up. So Tom was not like that at all. He was like us. He grew up with this stuff. One of my favorite stories that he told me, because I told you when I was 9 years old, every time I was in a swimming pool, I'd be like a dead man on the surface pretending I was Ed White. Well, he's a 9 years old on the other side of the country in Oakland, California. He's got his above ground pool in the backyard, and he's got a brick in his swim trunks to hold him down under the water, breathing air through a garden hose. That's how clever he was. So, the thing that made it a great experience was that it felt like they were replicating the spirit of Apollo on those sound stages. Everybody involved in the production just had the same feeling that the people who worked on Apollo, that Ken Mattingly told me about, of feeling part of something that's so much bigger than you, and doing something that's really challenging. Obviously, making a miniseries is not as challenging as actually doing the thing you're depicting. But it was, it was a big hurdle. And it was just a really special time to be able to be part of that. And
to be on camera, right? Well,
I was going to say
your big scene.
Yeah, the ham that I am. I asked any chance that you might have a little part for me, and Tom's assistant said he has just the thing for you. So he put me at the end of the first episode as the host of Meet the Press, and I will never forget. We were all at Disney Studios in Orlando, near Orlando. I think it's anyway, doesn't matter. We were at Disney Studios, and the time came to shoot that sequence. And I had been hanging out with all the actors. Bryan Cranston was just great, and Tony Goldwyn, and all the other guys who were playing the astronauts, and everybody else in the stories. And the time came to shoot this segment with the Meet the Press broadcast. And they had me go to the makeup trailer, And when I emerged, my hair was shorter than it had been since I was 7, right? Because once the Beatles hit, forget it. Buddy Holly glasses and a really skinny tie. And I walked out and I said, Tom, look what they did to me. And he said, can we say Babe Magnet? So it was just fun all the way along. But I always tell people, if you watch that, you will understand why no one pays me to be an actor.
Aw, don't sell yourself short. I thought you filled the part out very well.
Well, you're very kind.
Sometimes.
But I mean, can you imagine? I walked into the soundstage one day and they had just wheeled in this life-size replica of the Gemini spacecraft. And it was beautiful. I mean, it was like everything else. They had spent the money and taken the care to make it look right. And Tom came over and I said, God, Tom, this is the coolest thing I've seen all day. And he said, yeah, I know. I said, I think when all this is over, I'm going to take it home and put it in the garage. I'll put a TV in it and it'll be like, honey, if you want me, I'll be in the spacecraft.
I have the box set on my must-watch shelf here in New Jersey. So definitely wonderful to hear about that stuff. So
yeah, Tariq, we have to give a nod to our shared heritage. As I'm a space.com alum.
That's right.
And,
that's right.
I joined up in the summer of '99 when it was just getting going, or not quite at the very beginning. A lot of people had worked very hard to get it going by the time I showed up. But that was a very interesting experience. And, you've really been,
yeah, we're still going. We're still going.
Yeah.
So
well, you've kept it going. You and your gang have really kept it going, and my hat's off to you.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned being an intern earlier, and that's how I started here. Rod and I were talking about it earlier in an earlier episode. I came in 2001. I think I met you a few years later, and then you signed my Man on the Moon book right here. We were talking about that right before we started the show, so that was really exciting stuff. But I'm glad it's. I thank you for your service to the space.com mission, Andy, and you are welcome aboard as we continue back to the moon and Mars and wherever else we're going to go in the solar system, hopefully. So.
Well, let me just add, knowing some of what you go through and the fact that, I find it to be more than halftime just trying to keep a quarterly magazine going. My hat's off to both you guys, but especially you, Tariq, because you've been there so long, for staying with this hour to hour to minute operation, because that's just grueling. That's grueling.
Well, it helps. Just like Andy said, it helps when you get to write about rocket ships for a living, right, Andy? So,
yeah, it's true.
It does, but I don't think I could have held up for much longer than I did. I was there for a couple of years, and I remember when the Water on Mars story broke, the gullies and the craters that Mars Global Surveyor photographed, and the principal investigator of the camera, Mike Malin, was an old friend of mine. And so, I was able to talk to him and get some details that maybe other people weren't, sooner than other people were. And we broke the story, but that kind of intensity, that fast paced, feed the beast news cycle that never ends, man, I'm just not wired up for that. I enjoy it for short bursts, but I'm happy when I've got a stack of, NASA archival documents that I haven't seen before. I shouldn't say a stack, because these days they're all PDFs, and I could just kind of lose myself for a few hours delving into details of historical events and kind of pulling together the threads that I need to tell the story I want to tell. That's one of my comfort zones. I have to say, though, we've been talking about my writing career, but I gotta say, I am really enjoying teaching. I am really enjoying going into a room full of NASA engineers or other aerospace types and getting up and leading them through the stuff about success and failure. And just comes very naturally. In many ways, I find it comes more naturally to me than writing. There's a kind of a tendency to, for me, my wife and I call it historian speak, where I kind of lapse into this very kind of tamped down language that, is factually correct, but not necessarily as engaging as it needs to be to hold people's attention, especially in these days when our attention spans are quite challenged by, the scrolling culture that we live in. But teaching is, I never have a problem holding an audience when I get up to speak, I'm not saying that to blow my own horn. I'm just saying it feels very natural to me to do that.
So I've seen some of your talks, and I was particularly interested in them when I was doing something not quite similar to what you're doing, but I did a couple of years of experiential training for groups outside NASA at Johnson. But same kind of idea. I'd be talking about the history of the development of the F1 engine, for instance, while we're strolling past the Saturn V, which is the best prop on the planet. And
isn't that amazing? I've done that too. I've had that Saturn V as a prop.
Yeah, and you take the group. So just because we both have been to Johnson a bunch of times, you leave the little rocket engine garden, you walk down the building, and I would keep talking, so that these were mostly like groups of C-suite executives, not NASA folks. Keep talking to kind of keep their attention, not looking through the windows, get them to the door at the pointy end of the rocket and say, that was 1961. This is 1968. And I'd open that door, and I swear to God, half these case-hardened guys would burst into tears when they saw the Saturn V, because it's that unbelievable moment of finally seeing the scale of this whole operation. What did shock me, though, is we ran a pilot for some of the NASA folks, not all of whom were young. Some of them were within 10 or 15 years of my age, and a lot of them didn't know that much about that legacy, which surprised me, because I would have assumed that would be part of it, but I guess not.
Yeah, I've heard.
And I'm sure you've encountered that too. Yeah.
Well, I have a little bit, but I've heard some stories that would really shock you about how much basic history doesn't get absorbed these days necessarily. But on the other hand, I got to say, I've interacted with a lot of young NASA engineers, as well as older ones and veterans and so forth, and newbies who just got in. I find the level of enthusiasm is so high, the level of passion among the younger folks who are coming on board, or the ones who've been there for a little while, to work on Artemis, to have a chance to send humans back to the moon, to do these incredibly hard things, figure out how to solve these challenges, and then reap the rewards at the other end from science, from experience in deep space, all of it. And that is just really gratifying, that level of passion is still there, and it's not going away.
Well, and my hat's off to you for helping keep the legacy alive, and you're making sure that some of the lessons that were learned during the Apollo years that may not be committed to writing in a form that those folks are going to see, that's what you're communicating. And I think that's a lot of what you've been telling us about with your new book that's coming out soon.
Well, I hope by a year from now, we'll be just about ready to put it out. And if not, early 2024. There's a lot that has to happen. I have to, figure out. It's a sort of a self-help book for aerospace professionals, but it's also a historical bonanza in the sense that there's a lot of history in this book that has not seen the light of day before. And it's a mix of teaching and storytelling. So that's part of the challenge, is how do you do that? And so anyway, I think by a year from now, we should be really close to being done, close to being out.
And close to landing on the moon, or getting at least astronauts back around the moon, right? If 2024 bears out. So
more than
Artemis,
I do.
That's an Artemis 2 reference. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I all I know is what I read on space.com.
Oh, yeah. Thanks. I just wanted to kind of wrap up. You mentioned the book itself, and I'm just wondering why it is important to not just teach NASA, but remind everyone about why it's important to kind of keep those leadership skills going. Everything that was kind of everything during the Apollo era, of course, was the first time they were ever doing all of that, and now NASA's trying to do it, and they've learned those lessons before, but that was two generations or a generation past or whatnot. So, how. Go ahead.
No, well, it makes me think of one of my favorite stories. Bob Gilruth, who was the leader of the Houston contingent, and before that, the guys in Langley Research Center in Virginia, who did Project Mercury, the very first human spaceflight program that NASA did. But Bob Gilruth was kind of the spiritual core of how to do human spaceflight. And he and Max Vauget, who was the chief designer of the Mercury capsule and the Apollo command module, and also the space shuttle, he was kind of the father of the space shuttle in some ways. Max Vauget, this brilliant engineer, and Gilruth, also brilliant in his own way, walking along the beach at Galveston, Texas, a few years after Apollo ended, looking up at the moon. And Max told me this story quite a few years ago. Max has been gone for a while now. Anyway, they're looking up at the moon, and Gilruth said, Max, someday people are going to try and go back to the moon, and they're going to find out how hard it really was. And, at the time Max told me that story, it kind of got to me on one level, like, oh, that's a really kind of poignant thing for these two Apollo veterans to be saying to each other after they'd accomplished this momentous thing. Now, having been delving into what it really takes to succeed in spaceflight for 10 years, even from a human behavior standpoint, which is just one portion of the whole challenge. The engineering is hard enough. But I really have come to understand that as much as anything, that statement, they're going to find out it's harder than they realize, has to do with the fact that so much was not written down. Yes, there were fabulous documents called Apollo experience reports that got written about all the different aspects of Apollo after the fact, while the memories were still fresh. Yes, there are oral histories. Yes, there are technical reports and so forth. But at some level, there's a great body of knowledge that is, a lot of it is slipped out of reach because the people are no longer with us. Mm-hmm. But, I've been doing the best I can to kind of reconstitute it, to inform this book that I'm doing and the course that I teach. But the reason it's so important to preserve this is because it is so hard. It's a catchphrase today. It gets thrown around. Space is hard. Space is hard. Yes, space is hard. But that doesn't tell the whole story. It's hard in part because of the way we're wired up as human beings. And one of the things that we do as human beings is that we don't hold on to lessons for more than a certain amount of time. Look at what happened after Challenger. Just an amazingly short time after Challenger, NASA was already sliding back into the same patterns of thinking about the dominance of the flight schedule that they had been in before Challenger, and that really was a major factor in creating that accident. And what happened? We had another accident. And so if you look at the period, the mean time between the three human spaceflight accidents, Apollo 1 was January of 1967. Challenger was almost to the day, January of 1986. And Columbia was, again, almost to the day, February of 2003. The mean time between those things is like 17 years, which tells you we're kind of we're ready for another accident. Not that we will have an accident now, but it ought to make us very humble and wary of what are we missing? What is it that we are not seeing that's right in front of us? And you have to instill that mindset in people. You can never feel like you've got it nailed, because if you do, you're asking for trouble. And this is just scratching the surface of what of the kind of framework that I think people need to be thinking about and hearing about. But I'll give you that.
Well, this has been a pleasure. I want to encourage anybody listening to give themselves the treat of buying your book. It is available, and specifically A Man on the Moon. They should feel welcome to buy all of your books, but that's the one we've been talking about the most. It's available on Amazon and other sources. It's also available on Kindle. And Andy, you'll be pleased to know that somebody is selling a single unsigned paperback copy from 1994 for $170. Because that's just how weird the used book market is. Yeah. I've never quite figured out. I think they just put that stuff on the hook out there and hope that somebody will think, this must be special. So, think of how much money you've got sitting on your bookshelf in there. This has been a treat. I appreciate you making time. And remind us one more time where people can go to learn more about you and what you're up to.
Well, my website, I have to say I haven't blogged in an awful long time, but my website is andrewchaikin.com. There are some of my old blogs on there, but also my books. There's the book page, and some videos that I've produced to kind of get people excited about exploration. A way to contact me if you're interested in getting in touch or having me speak or that kind of thing. The usual things that authors do. Mm-hmm. And before too long, there will be a website about the Principles of Success in Spaceflight course and the companion books. So stay tuned for that.
Okay, we will indeed. Tariq, where do we track you down?
Well, I am at space.com as always. You can find me on the Twitters at Tariq J. Malik. The J this week stands for Jack-o'-lantern because it's Halloween. And you will find me walking around in my astronaut uniform on Monday night as we go trick-or-treating.
Aw, let's have a big awe for Tariq and his astronaut uniform. And as I've said before, I'd wear my Space Camp jumper from 1984, but it doesn't zip up all the way anymore. You can follow me at pylebooks.com or at astromagazine.com or on Twitter at Christyplanatia. Yes, it's a very strange handle. And that's assuming that Elon doesn't toss us all off by next week. And occasionally on Instagram. Don't forget to drop us a line at TWIS@twit.tv. That's TWIS@twit.tv. We'll welcome your comments, suggestions, and ideas. And, of course, your praise of Andy Chaikin. And feel free to email and communicate. And we take your emails to heart, and we answer every single one of them. Thanks for joining us for this discussion with Andy, author to the Spaceflight Stars. Don't forget, new episodes published every Friday on your favorite podcatcher, so make sure to subscribe and tell your friends, all your friends, and give us reviews. We'll take 5 stars or a thumbs up or whatever they're asking for. You can also head to our website at twit.tv/TWIS. And finally, you can follow the Twit Tech Podcast Network at Twit on Twitter and on Facebook and twit.tv on Instagram. Do it all. We're interesting folks. See you next week.
Listeners of this program get an ad-free version if they're members of Club Twit. $7 a month gives you ad-free versions of all of our shows, plus membership in the Club Twit Discord, a great clubhouse for Twit listeners. And finally, the Twit Plus feed with shows like Stacy's Book Club, The Untitled Linux Show, The Giz Fizz, and more. Go to twit.tv/clubtwit. And thanks for your support.